Thanks very much. I didn't have my headphone on with the interpretation, but so it pays off to have had a Spanish girlfriend 20 years ago. I still benefit from that. Thanks. Thanks for the introductions, and ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm asked to say a couple of words on the global trends on corporate responsibility, and I will do so. But I will first start with a short story. And you might think, what does this gorilla have to do with corporate responsibility? Well, this is a gorilla that lives in Virunga Park in Congo. That's one of the most treasured gorilla parks in the world. It's a World Heritage Site. But the interesting thing about this gorilla is this was not a very happy gorilla, because there was a company that wanted to drill for oil in this park. And the World Wildlife Fund didn't like that so much. So they started a huge case at our complaints mechanism, on which I will talk about a little bit later. And they filed a complaint at the complaints mechanism for the OECD in the UK. And I think I killed the whole thing. I should push this one. So what the WWF did is they paid for a full-page advertisement in the Financial Times, basically saying, well, the OECD is examining SOCO's drilling for oil in the Virunga Park. Why wouldn't investors do the same? And the interesting thing is that, in fact, this complaint went on in the national contact point, but behind the scenes, indeed, investors started calling the company. And the company listened very carefully to their investors. And, well, the good thing is this has a happy ending, because in fact, the company and World Wildlife Fund signed an agreement that the company will never drill for oil again in World Heritage Sites. So this was a major victory for this gorilla, of course, but also for the World Wildlife Fund and for the company, which did the right thing. So the interesting thing is that a new trend is that there's trillions of dollars in responsible investment funds, and these investors are trying to push companies to do better. This is another case. There was a case against a company called Mylan, and they were selling bromide, and this bromide was used for giving the death penalty. This was, of course, a big human rights issue. And here again, it was the pension funds that put pressure on the company to settle this with the complainants who were against selling this bromide for lethal injections. And here some big investors, big pension funds, they moved out. They said, well, the company is listening too slowly, so we no longer invest in this company, so we got out. But others stayed in and kept on pushing on a very high level, on CEO level, the company to make this deal. Well, the good thing here again is this company made an agreement to make sure that they do their due diligence, that their bromide will never be used for lethal injections. So this was a major victory for the human rights community, and of course also for the company, which came out very well. This is another case. This is perhaps even more inspiring. This is the Sheraton in the Maldives. It's a great place, but actually there was a case filed in the US, National Contact Point, which is our US grievance mechanism for the OECD. And basically what the complainant said, the trade unions, they said, well, our trade union members in the Maldives, they are harassed, and they are also sometimes fired without any reason, more than trying to organize our trade union. Well, the good thing here is that this company, Starwood, which is the owner of Sheraton, also made a big deal in many of their hotels in the world. They made sure that their trade union members were more protected, and the freedom of association was more respected. So this was again a big case, a win for Starwood and Sheraton hotels, and of course a big win for the trade union. So these are just a couple of cases which show how this works. Of course, we are looking at this from our complaints mechanism that's active worldwide. But it shows that this is not only about human rights, or only about climate change, or only about the other elements of the environment. This is about a wide variety of issues in corporate responsibility. And these are just a couple of good cases. Of course, I can also tell a lot of stories about bad cases, But these are cases that have been solved in our grievance mechanism. So how do we look at responsible business conduct? I know that you use the term here RSE, or corporate social responsibility. The OECD doesn't use that term. We use responsible business conduct or corporate responsibility. But the concepts are very much alike. So basically, to keep it simple, I always divide it in two. There is a side which is trying to do well by doing good, and there's a side which is focused on doing no harm. And these two are crucial elements of this concept, trying to have a positive contribution to sustainable development, but there are many cases like that. That's Coca-Cola training women entrepreneurs. That's Heineken sourcing local stuff from Africa. That's Nestle looking at diversity in their board. So that there are lots of good elements where you can see how companies have a positive contribution to sustainable development. And that's urgent now, because now with this sustainable development goals, businesses are called upon to do more in this respect. So that's a lot of opportunity. But we also look very much about the avoiding of doing harm, so avoiding negative impacts. That's, well, a very important point as well. And we see in the OECD that you can only do this if you integrate corporate responsibility into your whole corporate DNA. So this should not be something in the periphery or in the public relations department, because then it doesn't work. It needs to be embedded in the finance function. It needs to be embedded in procurement. It needs to be embedded in operations. So in the whole corporate governance, it needs to be embedded. Else you will not have the best results. Well, the first major point I'd like to make is that there is a very strong business case. And I was trying to make this business case, but, well, fortunately, businesses are making the business case for corporate responsibility all the time. You just have to look at Deepwater Horizon. Has been almost 100 times on the front page of the Financial Times. I think 20 billion settlement last year with BP. Volkswagen made another very good business case for corporate responsibility. And there are many mines in Latin America which make the business case every day. The Pascualama mine, the Conga mine, they make the business case for corporate responsibility all the time. So, but this is a lot about anecdotes, but there has also been a lot of more thorough research into the business case of corporate responsibility. And that focuses on the financial performance, sometimes net profit or other measures. This is one of the most authoritative research done by Harvard. And basically what it says is that weak corporate responsibility companies are outperformed by strong performance on ESG, which is the other term for corporate responsibility. So many of these studies are out there. It's much more conclusive that there is a positive relation between financial performance and strong performance on corporate responsibility. The French just made a report that the strong companies in corporate responsibility perform 13% better than the ones who do not perform well. So there's a lot of studies out there, and they all point in that direction. So the business case is quite clear. Well, just a couple of words on the OECD guidelines, because the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises are the international multilateral agreement on what corporate responsibility is. So basically 40 years ago, we already made a multilateral agreement, an international agreement between states, defining what corporate responsibility is. And the unique element of this instrument is that it has a grievance mechanism. And that's a legally binding obligation of the countries. So they all have to install a grievance mechanism. And it's a little bit of a hybrid instrument, because this instrument is not binding for governments, it's not binding for companies, but it is binding for governments. And you can say it's not legally binding for companies, but many commentators and many ministers have said, well, it may not be legally binding, but it's morally binding. So the definition of this is definitely that it's not optional to do this, but there's a strong push of the governments to behave according to these principles. So it's a very strong mechanism. And the unique element of this is, in fact, the case handling system that I described in my opening. So, if you look at it, of course, the OECD is not the whole world. China is not a member of this group, for example, but still, if you look at all the members, and many more members than just the OECD members are member of this international agreement, it covers still more than 85% of global trade and investment. So it really is still a huge coverage for this. And so it also is important to stress that the coverage is global value chains. So even if China didn't sign up to this agreement, the Chinese export industry selling the Foxconn stuff to Apple, that's all covered by the OECD guidelines. So there have been cases about Cambodia, about China, all not members of the OECD group. So the coverage is extremely wide. Then just a couple of words on the content. I will not go into the details because this is not rocket science. You all know this. This is basically the areas that are covered by the guidelines. It's about human rights, very strong aligned with the UN guiding principles, which has been adapted also in 2011. Same language. So de facto, this OECD system is also a grievance mechanism for the UN guiding principles. And labor, well, that's also not rocket science. It's freedom of association, it's no child labor, no forced labor, etc., etc. So this is all things that you all know about. So this is, in fact, the easy stuff. So I will not go into the easy stuff too much. This is all very much aligned, 100% aligned with the ILO standards. So de facto, the OECD grievance mechanism is also the grievance mechanism for the ILO standards. Environment, well, I just gave the example of this gorilla park. This is about deforestation, this is about climate change, etc. So do no harm on the environment is an important one. Bribery is, of course, a very important chapter, but that's also not something I will go into the details. Well, then these national contact points, that's the grievance mechanism. The heads of state of the G7 have given a strong push to make this stronger because it's the only thing out there. Basically, it's the only complaints mechanism related to corporate responsibility. And what you may expect, well, basically how this works, complaint can be brought by a trade union or by an NGO or, for example, by a local community. And you might think, well, oh, well, Panama is not a member of the OECD guidelines, so this will not affect Panama. Well, it can affect Panama, and actually there has been one case that affected Panama because there was a case in Germany against DHL, that's the big logistics company, about trade union issues in Panama. Of course, this was settled, this whole case, so that's a good sign. But you don't have to be a member of the OECD or the OECD guidelines to have cases. So the whole point is trying to solve problems. This is not about being a CSR court or anything. This is not legally binding. So this is trying to solve the problems by mediation. So basically we bang the heads together of the complainant and the company, set them in a room, put the temperature up and trying to solve this. And they can leave the room only if they solve this issue. And if they don't, well, then we have to take our own responsibility, look into the case, make an assessment and give a statement. And these statements have recommendations and they can sometimes have very strong impact. This is not just about some bad companies or just some peripheral companies. All the major companies in the world have had complaints against them. Well, basically all the big mining companies had cases. But you see here CNA, you see Unilever, Heineken, Nestlé, Michelin, you see car companies, you see Pepsi. But we have a very broad definition. So we even are now working on a case against FIFA about the World Cup in Qatar. So we try to solve all kinds of very complex issues. This is not about bad companies, but the issues are sometimes so complex that this system is trying to helping the companies to do better. So this is not something, if you have a case, it doesn't mean that you're a bad company or anything like that. So it's basically trying to work towards continuous improvement. Well, how does it work and what are the results of this. About half of the cases that have been accepted lead to an agreement, which is quite good in a sense as a result. And that can mean ending child labor in the company or in the supply chain. It can be, well, like I mentioned, no oil exploration in the World Heritage Site. It can be about human rights, not selling tear gas to dictatorships. It can have all kinds of results. Compensation for indigenous people. We just had a case a week ago where the indigenous people of Norway, well, that's a very rich country. They still have issues with indigenous people. They got compensation because there was a wind farm. So there can be all kinds of solutions in this field. And like I said, this is not optional. And you also see that more and more countries are attaching serious consequences to this. For example, in Canada, if you don't cooperate in this system, you won't get any more subsidies, you won't get any more export credit guarantees. And it has also already been applied. So, for example, in the China gold case, it was a gold mine. They didn't cooperate. They had a negative statement from the complaints mechanism. They lost all diplomacy efforts from the government. But it's a small teeth, you see. It's a small mouth. The bigger teeth to corporate responsibility nowadays is, like I said in the opening, is given by responsible investors. There's a group called PRI, Principles for Responsible Investors. They are committed to put their money where their mouth is when it comes to responsibility. So they are pushing companies to solve their issues. And we have already seen in a couple of cases, a couple of them I already mentioned, where they actually behind the scenes put their money behind it, and basically called the CEO and said, well, solve this, else we're going to sell our shares. And nobody wants that. So this is really a force of finance for good. So this big mouth is a mouth that's even getting bigger in the next couple of years. Well, this is Hillary Clinton. She was the chair of the negotiations of the OECD guidelines. And now we come to the difficult stuff, because when we negotiated in 2011, we found also a multilateral agreement on supply chain responsibility. Well, that's actually the heavy stuff. And like you see here in her speech, she said, well, due diligence, that's the concept to manage supply chain responsibility, while not always easy, but it's essential. And that's one of the key concepts. So due diligence is the name of the game. So if you look at all the major discussions in the world on corporate responsibility, well, the most difficult ones are about supply chain responsibility, and it's really difficult. Because sometimes these things go several layers deep into the supply chain. We work, for example, on conflict minerals. Airbus and Boeing, they are 12 layers in their supply chains away from the conflict in Congo, but they're still trying to manage it. And so you see that it's not just one layer deep, supply chain responsibility. You can be held accountable for things that go on in your supply chain somewhere. And this is not easy, because many of the multinationals we work with have more than 100,000 suppliers. So imagine how difficult it is to manage this. So in that sense, we had to find a very creative way and also a workable way for companies to do this. Because you cannot manage 120,000 supply chains, several layers deep, and manage all the human rights and environmental and labor aspects. You just cannot do that. You would be out of job immediately. So that's one of the difficulties. I will not go into the details of this because it's way too complex. But one thing you should remember is that it's basically about identifying the risks in your supply chain, then manage them and prioritize them, because you cannot do all the 120,000 suppliers. Focus on where the severity of the impacts are the most high, and then you have to be accountable. So that means reporting, etc. So in that sense, this sounds easy, but this is in fact very, very complex. This is not zero tolerance. Like I said, you can make mistakes. This is not about perfection. This is about continuous improvement, mapping your risks in your supply chains, and trying to push your suppliers and the suppliers of your suppliers, and sometimes more layers deep if it really comes to the hard stuff. For example, child labor, forced labor. You have to go even deeper than one layer. And then try to use your influence in the supply chains to make sure that your suppliers are doing the right thing too. And this is a very high benchmark, but this is also a benchmark that protects companies from unreasonable expectations, because there are many also, for example, NGOs, which would like to see that all the responsibility of everything that goes wrong in all these supply chains is put on the shoulders of this company on the top of the chain. So this is a high benchmark, but also protection against unreasonable high expectations. This is Rana Plaza in Bangladesh. This happened a while ago, a real tragedy. And it's important to stress that also here, due diligence in the supply chain is key to prevent these kind of tragedies from happening. And because of this tragedy, we started working with specific sectors on developing more detailed expectations on what supply chain responsibility is. So we basically brought all the world's major garment and footwear manufacturers and retail chains together with the trade unions, with the NGOs, to create a multi-stakeholder agreement on garment and footwear, like we've done a couple of years too on conflict minerals, and we've also done something on agricultural supply chains. So we tend to focus on the high-risk sectors and work with multi-stakeholder groups to basically give more practical guidance on what due diligence then in fact means for this sector. So this is really the difficult stuff. Also the financial sector, they are covered by this system too. They are covered by all the expectations of corporate responsibilities as well. They are also putting a lot of pressure on the projects they run or on the investments they have made. So, to come to a conclusion, first of all, this is not something optional. Maybe a couple of years ago you could say, oh well, CSR is voluntary, so we just see it as an option. That's no longer the case. It's far more serious than that. The societal pressures are huge. They are far more strong. The governments are paying attention. They are attaching consequences to these issues. So that's one thing, not optional. And the second one is that the governments in many, for example, European countries, but also US and other countries, Canada, they attach legal consequences to it. So, for example, the conflict minerals work we have done is now made mandatory in the EU. So the companies have to do their due diligence in their supply chains on the minerals they have. So, and then the business case, there is a clear business case, apart from the moral case. So there's no way to hide from that. And then, okay, the last one, that's really the tough work. Pay attention to your supply chain responsibility and make due diligence a central concept of your company. And basically that means that the companies have to manage their gorillas in their supply chain and in their companies and make sure that they're happy. Thanks very much.